Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll get started in just a minute. I just want to make sure everyone has had a chance to join the Zoom before we officially begin. But in the meantime, I've put some helpful links in the chat for everyone. And feel free also to put in the chat where you're tuning in from today. We always like to see where in the world our audience is joining from. And again, if you're just logging on, thanks for joining us. We'll get started in just another minute. And feel free to share with us in the chat where you're joining from. We have someone from Scranton, Pennsylvania, so thanks for joining us. And I'm just going to give everyone else maybe about 30 more seconds to join before we officially begin. For those of you just joining, welcome. We'll get started in just a moment. And if you're just joining, I have some links in the chat that will be helpful for you during the program, so feel free to take a look at that. And it looks like most people have joined, so I'll go ahead and get things started since I know everyone is eager to hear today's presentation. So good afternoon, everyone. And thank you again for joining us today. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Haskell Tydor Curatorial Internship Program Talk, Invoking the Holocaust, Ritual, Protest, and Post-War Jewish Identity. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you'll visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn those on or off are posted in the Zoom chat. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Again, that's the Zoom Q&A box and not the chat. Now today, we are honored to be joined by Jonathan Marrow and Professor Judy Tydor Baumel-Schwartz. Jonathan Marrow is currently a PhD student in history at Cambridge University, where he researches transnational Holocaust memory. His dissertation concerns the development of Holocaust tourism from the 1960s to the present. Marrow previously graduated from Georgetown University with a BA in history and holds a master's degree in Jewish studies from Oxford University. He spent several years as a history instructor at schools across the United States, including Boston, Massachusetts, and Chattanooga, Tennessee, teaching courses on Holocaust ethics, American civics, and world history. Professor Judy Tydor Baumel-Schwartz is the director of the Arnold and Leona Finkler Institute of Holocaust Research, the Abraham and Edita Spiegel Family Professor in Holocaust Research, the Rabbi Pinchas Brenner Professor in Research on the Holocaust of European Jewry, and Professor of Modern Jewish History in the Israel and Golda Kaczynski Department of Jewish History and Contemporary Jewry at Bar Ilan University in Israel. She is also the consulting historian and curator of the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York. Thank you all again for joining us, and now I'm going to hand things over to Judy to say a few words before Jonathan's presentation.
Thank you very much, Isabel. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Jonathan, for everything that you have done for the Museum of Jewish Heritage. We are at a public presentation for the Chaskel Tydor Curatorial Assistant, an annual thing that we have at the museum. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about the person behind that title. Who was Chaskel Tydor? First of all, he was my father, and he was a Holocaust survivor. He was born in Poland. He grew up in Germany. He was taken into custody by the SS the first week of the war, sent to Buchenwald, spent 2.5 years there, from where he was transferred to Auschwitz. He was in Auschwitz between 1942 and the beginning of 1945, when he was sent with tens of thousands of other Auschwitz prisoners on what was known as the Death March. He ended up back in Buchenwald, where he was liberated on April 11th, 1945. And within a short time, he was one of the founders of the first post-war pioneering Zionist kibbutz, known as Kibbutz Buchenwald, which he brought the first group to pre-state Israel in September 1945. He had lots of odysseys before and after that. He had a family before the war. I have a brother and sister who survived the war, who are much older than I am. His first wife was murdered, along with her parents and his parents. And after the war, he remarried, and I am the result. So that's the family side of it. The historical side of it is that, as I said, my father was a Holocaust survivor. But interestingly enough, he did not see that until his latter years as his calling card. In other words, when people would ask him who he was, that's not what he would say. And surely, interestingly enough, on his tombstone, it never occurred to me to put on the words that he was a Holocaust survivor, because, as I said, this was a man who did not look back. He always looked forward. He was very, very involved with the idea of Jewish education, educating people in general about the Holocaust, about Jewish history, educating Jews in particular about their heritage, and the combination of the two, accepting people as wonderful human beings who all have the capacity of learning and trying to promote that himself, was one of the things that he did in his lifetime. He was not an educator by profession, but that was one of the most important things to him, which is why after his death, we founded the Memorial Curatorial Internship, in which young people could use their skills to learn more about the Holocaust, to work in the subject, and of course, to present it to the public, which is what we are doing here today. So with that, I pass over the baton to Jonathan, and he will speak about one of the more interesting topics that he found in the collection, in which he's been working for the past few weeks. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, and thank you so much, Judy. It's an honor to have this opportunity to do this work at the museum, and also to honor the father's memory. I will share some of the objects that I want to talk about today. But yeah, again, my thanks to this opportunity to work at the museum this summer, to dive into this collection, to work in this place that's really, the Museum of Jewish Art is brimming with excitement. It's really an exciting place to work. People, incredible discoveries every day. And I've had a summer that's ranged from keywording objects in our collection that make them more accessible, both internally and hopefully soon to the public, cataloging past acquisitions, new acquisitions with more information, researching possible acquisitions of object, writing up public blogs and social media posts for the museum. So it's been kind of chock full of different activity. And the thing that I'm struck by most of all is not just our interesting collections, which I'll get to in just a sec, but also the commitment of the folks here, especially here in the curatorial team, to keeping a lot of these stories alive. And there's so many questions about what Holocaust memory means as we move into post-survivor generation. But I'm just, and the amount of individual stories that are all fascinating and multifaceted and complex. And I'm so full of admiration for my colleagues here who care and really are emotionally committed to making these stories valuable. So my thanks to that, and also for the opportunity to deepen my PhD research, which is about American Holocaust memory in the 20th century. How American Holocaust memory has become so prominent in education, in the museum world, and popular culture. And more specifically, I'm looking actually at Holocaust tourism, and so how museums and tourists and visitors kind of consume and exchange. So it's been really fascinating to be on the other side of this curtain and look at that. And so I wanted to keep up this meta interest in Holocaust memory and think about, we have, of course, great collections of Jewish history and Holocaust related items, but to think about what do we have that relates to the enactment of Holocaust memory since 1945? And so what I found in the collections is really a fascinating array of objects, from posters to liturgical documents and objects to you can see a fascinating cartoon by Arthur Schick on the left there that tell an interesting story of change over time. Now, in my little field of Holocaust memory, a generation ago, it was very fashionable for some scholars like Peter Novick and Norman, more controversially, Finkelstein, to argue that the first decades of Holocaust awareness in America saw a silence in which American Jews were maybe ashamed of the Holocaust, felt insecure about their place in public life. Survivors were repressed, as we kind of already heard, that there was a post-war Cold War alliance with Germany, and so there was this public pressure, maybe from politically, to kind of not speak badly of Germany. And so as a result, maybe organized American Jewish organizations repressed this any sort of memorialization or discussion of the Holocaust. And this was a powerful view in academia. More recently, this has been challenged. People like Hazia Diner at NYU have written saying this is not really the whole story, that if you look at American Jewish media, if you look at, again, liturgical objects, if you look at newspapers, there was actually a lot of public discussion of the Holocaust. There was fundraising for survivors in DP camps. There were memorial services. There were small cemeteries, monuments set up by survivors organizations, by organizations of survivors and their descendants from specific towns in Eastern Europe. There was a lot of depictions of the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial uprising by Nathan Rappaport in Jewish media. And so this kind of a back and forth about what the first, whether there was a rise in the 1960s and 1970s. And that's what people like Peter Novick would argue, that it only was with the Eichmann trial, with the 1967 and 73 wars, with events like the Entebbe kidnapping, that there was a more public consciousness of the Holocaust. So I find this argument to be interesting, but ultimately a little limited. There's a bit of both. I mean, if you look in our collections, you can see that we have early Holocaust memorials, one on the left here, for a small local Jewish group that was set up in 1952, small cemetery memorials. Here, there's a public memorial, 1953, for the victims of the Bialystok ghetto. This was at the Bialystoker Old Age Home here in New York on East Broadway. So even in the early 1950s, there was some public discussion within the Jewish community of the memorial of the Holocaust. There were even big rallies. I mean, in the 1960s, you have Warsaw Ghetto Uprising rallies taking place at Carnegie Hall and other major venues, with letters written in by President John F. Kennedy and so forth. So there is a certain level of activity that we can speak to. And another object I'll show you here, I've found this lovely thing that there's always concern in the Jewish community for victims, survivors of Nazi persecution, an ad for an apartment in New York here, specifically for survivors or a victim of persecution, asking for wanting to select it for them specifically. There, we see here in Jewish media, there's a replete of references, especially to kind of the potential threat of German rearmament, or this idea of, could there be a resurgence of Nazism or anti-Semitism in Germany? And also discussion of, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, again, this important leitmotif of the Holocaust. And so these are both from Jewish Life, which is the predecessor publication to now the left-wing Jewish publication, Jewish Currents. And you can see kind of front and center in the early 1950s, you have this focus. On the incredible object too, this is a silk scarf, 20 inches by 20 inches, for the 20th anniversary of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, with images of the Nathan Rappaport Memorial on it, with this idea of peace all over the world. A really interesting object that show how people, even in this early ages, 20 years on, not less than 20 years from the end of the Holocaust, are playing with or are experimenting with Holocaust memorialization. And you have images, and I wanted to show this especially because this is a little teaser for the exciting. We have an exciting exhibition my colleagues in Curatorial are working on about the art and life of Arthur Szyk, incredible Polish-American artist who made a number of anti-Nazi, array of anti-Nazi memorabilia and images during World War II. Some of which were being reprinted, this one in the foreword, in Jewish publications in the late 1940s. And I believe this will be on display when this phenomenal exhibition, you have to see it, opens up in December of this year. But it did take, to be clear, all that aside, it took a lot of public events to bring this memory outside the Jewish community to a wider audience. And so events like the kidnapping, very well publicized kidnapping and then public trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1960-61, a major functionary of the Holocaust. And here we've got in our archives, we have a ticket to the Eichmann trial, signed and stamped, that did so much to kind of start bringing to a wider American audience this awareness. Before I wanted to look at, okay, so what does Holocaust memory mean as we go to a broader public awareness? And I wanted to jump in a second to haggadot. Start off with actual Jewish religious documents. I've always been fascinated by the Passover Haggadah, in part because my own family has many arguments about which Haggadah we should use. We've made some of our own in the past. I've been by the art of them, by the creative choices of them. So I wanted to look at how do we see Passover memory represented in haggadot. Here we've got just to give you a hint of the kind of the range we have in our own archives. Just from the late 1990s, these are three different really fascinating haggadot. One for a Black Jewish kind of interracial ecumenical seder. One a Zionist themed Haggadah for Yom HaAtzmaut, which is not even the only Zionist one. We have a couple of these from the late 1940s and early 1950s. Kind of Zionist-themed Haggadot, which at one point were printed for the IDF and then banned because of the rabbinate objected to them, the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel. And then on the right here, again, a slightly early LGBT-themed Haggadah. So a fascinating array. But I want to talk about how we see change over time in Haggadot. Now, in World War II, there were some kind of makeshift Haggadahs that spoke of Holocaust, spoke of Hitler, spoke of freedom and liberation. Obviously, an incredibly connected theme to a time of persecution. But in the post-war years, you don't necessarily have such explicit mentions. Sometimes you had pamphlets added in with Nazi references. This is an early one from the 1950s, made by, as in classic style, made by a matzah maker, free, given out Haggadah. Which doesn't have an explicit Holocaust reference, but it has, I think, very interesting imagery of flames, fire rising from the ashes, which I think is that a burning bush? I think if you look at this image very closely, you see that it's burning books. It gives off kind of these kind of maybe a veiled Holocaust reference. Many people know the very famous Haggadah since the 1930s, at least. Made by Maxwell House, the merchant, and as you see that this Haggadah doesn't change much stylistically over the decades. Here you got from left to right, 1935, 1951, 1962, very similar in what they show on the inside and on their style on the outside, even in the coloring. But if you open them up, you see a change happen in 1962. This is the 1962 Maxwell House production, and up until this point, it's identical on the insides, the script, the composition. But a page is added in the early 1960s about the genesis of freedom, about the universal implications of the Holocaust, about the importance of not just the Magna Carta, not just the U.S. Constitution and Israel, the Charter of the UN. I think that's an interesting idea that there's a new rising language of human rights that at least is maybe tangentially tied to the Holocaust, but still not that many explicit references. Until we get to after the 1970s, in the period I'm going to focus on today, we found fascinating, much more direct references to the Holocaust, sometimes pull-out quotes, sometimes focuses on people like Hannah Senesh. But But there's one haggadah I want to talk about today that was commissioned in 1984 by a couple, Mr. and Mrs. Siegfried Wallach, who commissioned a limited edition haggadah that is specifically in memory of the Holocaust. Now, this couple was the children of Holocaust survivors who died in World War II, or not survivors, they passed away in World War II, and they dedicated a Holocaust specifically with art entirely focused on it. So you see here a Seder plate with a Star of David and barbed wire at the center, the matzah, the symbol of freedom, broken in half, brick motifs, really, really visually striking. You see again, interspersed with the words, you have more barbed wire, the prisoner stripes of a concentration camp uniform. On the right, you have the traditional Passover symbols, the slaughter of cattle with visceral flames and drops of blood. Perhaps one of the most searing images of any Holocaust representation, a burning synagogue here and a burning Star of David depicted in really striking form. And the pile of suitcases, and I love it's somewhat depressing, but what this Haggadah does with the traditional drops of blood for the 10 plagues, represented as literal drops of blood ritually done on Passover with crematoria, with smokestacks. I think Passover, of course, is a holiday that is referenced in every generation. And what I was struck even as a child by is the idea that you are told, this is what God did to you. There's a perennial nature, there's a cyclicality to the way that Passover reifies something that happened in the past, that brings it to the present. God does this for you in every generation. And what's happening here, I think, is interesting, is it's doing that too with the Holocaust, that you see a transition to the Holocaust, maybe as represented in the 1950s, as something that passed, should be memorialized, should be remembered. But now we're moving into an era after the 1960s where it's more of a current day thing. As we go farther away from it, it somehow seems more relevant. So I want to explore that idea by moving from religious ritual to political activism by Jews, by American Jews, as we move through the course of the century. Now, again, I want to make a quick point about the incredible collections of the museum. We have a lot of Jewish campaign paraphernalia here. I love this, especially really the Jewish causes but even just Jewish candidates. So we've got all these incredible thousands of political buttons. So from the March on Washington, which of course Jews took part in, that Martin Luther King famously spoke at, to the first major party candidate for American president of Jewish descent, Barry Goldwater, in 1964, to, of course, Joseph Lieberman, who ran as vice president, modern Orthodox Jew, in 2000 on a ticket with Al Gore. And here you've got a great button that says chutzpah, which I loved finding out. And we have many other Gore Lieberman campaign buttons. So we've got great collections. But so how do campaign items like this show Holocaust memory as the 20th century goes on? Well, you especially find this in the campaigns on behalf of Soviet Jewry and their rights and their ability to emigrate from the Soviet Union over the course of the 1960s and 1990s. And here are 3 buttons that give different themes. An Exodus March in 1973, Solidarity Sunday, a common commitment in the spring of 1973, and 1972, that very stark yellow star, which maybe I'm too Holocaust pilled, but for me, I can't help but see a Jewish 1940s star that the Nazis would have made Jews wear, now being worn several decades later on behalf of Soviet Jews and their persecution. And I think that's an interesting change. So activism on behalf of Soviet Jews, though it's often remembered as a 1970s and 80s phenomenon, had been going on in the 1960s. You see major rallies in Madison Square Garden and marches in Ottawa that we have documentation of from as early as the mid-60s. But in the 70s, it goes beyond maybe biblical references and hopes for there to a new type of rhetoric. I say here, plus ça change, plus ça la même chose. This idea that what is going on in Russia today is a repeat of the Nazi persecution, that it has somehow come back to life, is a new theme that you have here. And so the boycott of the 1980 Olympics in Moscow, Berlin 1936, Moscow 1980, the similarity between these two nations is being put forward by campaigners on behalf of Soviet Jews. To be clear, this is not, just because you wear a star that doesn't necessarily mean you are wearing a Holocaust scar. Here's a very nice Jewish Heritage Week star that doesn't necessarily give off any Holocaust related imagery or ideas like a bright yellow star talking about persecution does. And it's not the only theme that we wear. Soviet Jewry employed a lot of themes, especially biblical themes, the idea of let my people go, going back to that Passover Exodus story. Of this one is it, the parting of the Red Sea here, this poster, is it going to take another miracle to lead the Jews out of Russia? But I do think there's something interesting going on with this idea that Nazism has come back, even under very different circumstances, that we are now wearing, and I'll go back for a second just to show you that, that yellow star again, that you are wearing it on your body, this Jewish symbolism, as a victim would have done in the 1940s, and also that that you are wearing, that you're kind of referencing this as a repeat. And this gets even more interesting when you get to events like the threat of neo-Nazis marching in Skokie, Illinois in 1978, a major event in the Jewish community when a neo-Nazi organization, National Socialist American organization, tried to march at first in Chicago and then in the Chicago suburb of Skokie, Illinois, where a huge amount of Holocaust survivors and their descendants, I believe about 7,000 out of 7,000 people out of this town of 70,000 were either Holocaust survivors and their family. And there was this huge level of activism in the Jewish, debate in the Jewish community about free speech rights, also what should be done, and then how to best combat it. And these are some images, never again Treblinka, of course, the threat of neo-Nazism, even a small and not very representative band of neo-Nazis threatened. So this brought up ideas of, could it happen here? And so the poster I showed at the beginning, Warsaw 1943, Skokie 1978, the specter of neo-Nazism, however small and unrepresentative, because this group was really very minor, and as neo-Nazism has always generated this fear of not only neo-Nazism rampant in Germany, Europe, but brought over to America. Now, Jewish organizations, media have always focused on the threat of these kind of organizations. You have media here, by white supremacist organizations on behalf of to free Rudolf Hess, the Hitler we loved and why. I shouldn't laugh, but it's a striking book published by these kind of organizations that we have in our archives. To publications, the American Nationalist, full of white supremacist kind of conspiracy theories about international Jewry, as ever, republishing of documents like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a notorious early 20th century forgery alleging plot for Jewish world government. But I think while these were always concerns of the Jewish community, there's new force given them in the 1970s, maybe, as this really real threat, even when arguably they were less relevant than ever, and public attitudes as measured by public polling showed that they were not really probabilistic. Here are some posters made by an artist named Tydor in the 1970s, showcasing either very playful but also serious against the threat of neo-Nazis marching. That yellow star, it can happen here never again. Hitlerism is alive and sick on 71st Street in Chicago. The one on the right there I find to be very fascinating. It gave rise to people in the wider Jewish community, also very specific organizations like the Jewish Defense League a far-right, really racist organization committed to self-defense that started in the late 1960s by Mordechai Kahana, that took some of the cultural zeitgeist ideas prevalent in Black Power and certain parts of the 1960s and tried to bring it to America by warning of this idea of an ever-present renewed Holocaust threat. You can kind of see the imagery here on the right here. We've got traditional buttons of, Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in the 1970s, but we also have more experimental ones here. Skokie March with a burning swastika, 1938 Apathy, 1978 Action. So again, that relating times. Remember Hamelek, a quote that's been very much in the news I don't think I have to remind any of, but the conflict between American values and the swastika, I think a very powerful image. And as I said, the Jewish Defense League, not necessarily a representative organization, but one of many organizations that is starting to use very powerful Holocaust imagery. This is an advertisement for them in the 1970s, advertising a self-defense camp for Jewish men, saying, the Nazis used to send us to camps, but never again. In order to make that real, we have to have our own self-defense camps. A mailing urging fundraising, saying the Jewish state is on the verge of a Holocaust in the 1970s. So using that same language that was actually, of course, at the time being raised in Israel by the political rise of Menachem Begin, who became prime minister in either 1977 or 1978, getting the exact year. So that is becoming a more prominent rhetorical line. Now, I focus on some of these maybe ways that Holocaust memory is used. To be clear, it's not all the same. Sometimes Holocaust memory is used just to oppose genocides as taking place. You have Darfur in 2006, New Yorkers, Jewish organizations talking about that. On the right here, it's a poster from 2002 during towards the end of during the Second Intifada of Jews who've been killed, and again thinking about, as might be most common when it comes to Jews and Jewish organizations, thinking about the Holocaust through the prism of Israel. While Jews are being murdered, this is a mistake. We can't afford to repeat that obvious overtones of the Holocaust. But I think there's something really interesting going on with this switch to direct identification, that we're not just memorializing the past, but it's something present. And I think there's several reasons this is going on at the time. There's a certain cultural zeitgeist in the 1970s, a focus on victimization, self-exploration, and survival. I'm thinking of Christopher Lasch and writers like that. There's a great historian, William Graebner, who talks about the idea that survival became this powerful cultural concept across America in the 1970s, that after Vietnam and the oil crisis, economic and political decline in America, that there was this powerful cultural sense that Americans were all survivors of one atrocity or another, that if you look in word searches and newspaper articles, that survival, the word often related to the Holocaust, becomes present in movies, that people talk about survivors of abuse and of incest, of things like this. And it makes Americans, not just Jews, more interested in survival. The white ethnic revival, a cultural moment that historians like Matthew Fry Jacobson have written about, show that for white ethnics, quote unquote, non-WASP white groups, so Jewish Americans, Italian and Irish Americans, that there's this rediscovery of their ethnic heritage in the 1970s, almost an emulation or reaction to the Black cultural revival and Black Power movements in the 1960s. That makes those ethnic groups more interested in their ethnic heritage. And perhaps some people arguably right that it gives rise to a new form of victim politics, that as opposed to being stigmatized, that America, as James Young, a great chronicler of Holocaust monuments, wrote in the 1970s, was becoming a culture of competing catastrophes for each group. And so that maybe Jews, some argue, are interested in kind of indulging in this catastrophe again, not just as ethnic heritage, but as something that is present. But those are some kind of complex cultural arguments. In part, it's just, as Harold Macmillan said about politics, British Prime Minister, events, my dear boy, events, and that there's there's a new generation of cultural depictions that pioneer this too. A TV series that I've done a credible amount of research on, called Holocaust, was released on NBC with Meryl Streep in 1978, watched by some 120 million Americans, mostly forgotten now. It really brought Holocaust awareness to the fore. Now, it did so. It wasn't the first Holocaust depiction on American television, though it was the most popular of its time, or in any of the cultural work. But it did something striking in arguably pretty poor soap opera form. It made Holocaust memory personal. It took on this very relatable middle-class family of assimilated German Jews, and showed their individual fictional story. And so a lot of Americans could tune in and feature that direct form of identification. And they appreciated it at the time. It was wildly successful, even though, as I said, if you watch it now, it's not great cinema, arguably. And so when I remember a couple of years ago when I was doing research on this, on the way it was promoted by American Jewish organizations and received by Americans, there were marches by Christians organizations in solidarity with the release of this fictional television show, where Christian churches on the Sunday that it came out wore yellow stars of David in solidarity with their that kind of the premiering, the broadcast of this series. And I think that's an interesting maybe idea that this Jewish practice is going outside of just the Jewish community to a wider context. So what does it mean when you have this level of direct identification, and not just among Jews, but among a wider group? It brings up, there's a scholar at UVA called Alison Landsberg, whose work I'm fascinated by. She's got a book called Prosthetic Memory, where she kind of asks how individual and collective memory is changing as part of the technologies, modernity and post-modernity. And she suggests that with modern technologies, you have this change in individual and collective memory that she calls prosthetic, where at experiential sites like museums, in certain movies, Schindler's List, you have a form of memory being enacted where people, she says in very technical terms, suture themselves into a larger history. Christians go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum or watch Schindler's List, and they take on as their own personal memory this feeling of this prosthetic memory of a past event. If you look at the way these sites, it's not coincidental that she literally talks about in this broader context of technology. On the cover of her book, you see a photo of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., that these media works and museums really use experiential feelings, like walking through a cattle car and watching in a movie, the feeling of really going through the Holocaust itself. Is this identification good? There's some dispute. I mean, I think as Holocaust memorial institutions, we want people to feel related to this history, to empathize. But of course, some people are concerned about this. Elie Wiesel, of course, famous and the most famous Holocaust survivor, and certainly in the United States at least, argued even after the months after Holocaust, the series came out, said, and I thought the speech that the Ninth Secretary Y is fascinating. He says, the Holocaust, I even hesitate now to use the word. When we must qualify, do I mean the show or the event? The Holocaust no longer evokes the mystery or the forbidden. Now, to be clear, he had very specific views about Holocaust sacrality and mystery. But I do think it's an important word of warning. Does over-identification by Jews or non-Jews take too much of, can it have negative impulses, this feeling of the Holocaust taking place over time? I want to finish by thinking about museums themselves, and the Museum of Jewish Heritage. What did museums, I'm looking at now in my PhD research about museums in different places in Europe, in Israel, of course, and here American museums like the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And I want to finish with an object of the museum's representation of itself. James Young, who is the preeminent, as I said, scholar of one of the preeminent scholars of memorials, once wrote that European Holocaust museums, begin and end with this destruction of Europe's Jews. They focus on the destruction. Arguably, museums in Israel, focus perhaps have this bias against the pre-war European diaspora as being half dead. But American Holocaust museums, maybe, are able to reflect with an exilic bias, and they showcase actually perhaps more vibrancy and richness of Jewish life, the Jewish life that was lost in the Holocaust. That they don't just focus on either the remains of the Shi'aret Haftelah, the saving remnant, or the the machinery of destruction. Certainly they focus on this, but also what was lost, that complex life lost. That's something that all museums have to deal with. I want to close by showing you this poster from the Museum of Jewish Heritage, released in the year that it was that this museum opened in 1997, showing perhaps this museum trying to deal with some of those tensions. People ask me this summer where I work, I say the Museum of Jewish Heritage - a living memorial to the Holocaust, which of course is a long name, and some people say, oh, the Jewish History Museum or the Holocaust Museum. There's obviously tensions between both of those things. But I think, and perhaps you might say, are those fundamentally contradictory tensions? Can you work through both doing Jewish history and the Holocaust? This poster, it shows that our core exhibitions are about the Holocaust. The core exhibition that Judy and others did such an amazing job on focuses incredibly on the Holocaust, but it also shows great items of Jewish heritage. Here you've got the poster represented, as is currently in our core exhibition, a sukkah cover made by a man named Arya Steinberger in Hungary in the 1920s and 30s, a local member of the Orthodox community, shochet, ritual slaughterer. He created by himself this for his family, this sukkah cover that shows incredible scenes of Jewish culture. The fact that the Museum of Jewish Heritage at its opening was advertising with this beautiful object that showed Jewish heritage, while at the same time being a Holocaust museum, I think shows that at least this institution, I'll give a push for, since I look at it with very rosy eyes. It's very beautiful. It's able to kind of work through those trends, thinking about the Holocaust, but also thinking about the incredible Jewish culture that's behind that. And for me, there's so many objects in our collection that I love. I've shown you a couple that we have today, but this one, which doesn't even do it justice, this poster of the object, which is huge, wraps around the second room in our core exhibition, is really powerful. And I think the Museum of Jewish Heritage does do a great job of dealing with what does it mean to identify with the Holocaust, but also tell a broader story as part of keeping Holocaust memory alive. So with that, I'll just say thank you for your attention today.
Thank you, Jonathan, so much for that wonderful presentation. And thank you to our audience members. Adjusting my mic. I hope that's hear me better. Thank you, Jonathan, for that great presentation. Thanks to our audience for submitting questions. We now have about 10-15 minutes for some audience questions. So, Jonathan, I'll go ahead and ask you some questions. And just a reminder to our audience, for those of you who have more questions or haven't yet submitted a question, feel free to submit questions while we're speaking, and I'll pull from them. So just to start, we have, some people who are curious if you can talk a little bit more in depth about the research process, and in particular, how you went about finding the sources and objects you used, and once you found them, how you sort of decided which ones to focus on, because I'm sure there is a wealth of objects to choose from.
For sure. So it's funny because I'm playing around with our catalog searching technology all summer. And so some of these have been objects I picked up and trying to keyword. Some of this was, I really went through thousands of objects for hours and hours, and looked through every object we have post 1945 to think of we have incredible pre-war Jewish collections. We have incredible items related to Holocaust, stories of survival or discrimination, but just what we have. So I did, after the war that has ended up in the museum that fits our collection guidelines. And then also some, I mean, I always knew wanted to focus on Holocaust memory and looking at haggadot. And so I went through all our I think we have about 100 or more haggadahs of very different types, and I just found it just really interesting to pull, and then was able to get them out of storage, thanks to the folks of the great work of folks in our collections registration department, that just looking at different LGBT themed haggadahs, Zionist haggadahs, that are really interesting. So a bit of, as kind of think with all historians searching, a bit of casting the net very wide. You just got to, and then just trying some different searches and so forth. So.
Well, thank you for sharing. We have a couple other questions, kind of wondering how you really got started working on this research. I know it does relate a bit to your dissertation in school, and so some people are wondering how much of this sort of final project that you presented today was influenced mainly by the museum's collection, and how much did you come in thinking about from your work at school?
Thing. Yeah, and I also, after I'll say, I see Judy's hand raised, so
Yeah, I
I'll
was gonna
give her the
say.
time. But I'll just answer that quickly. The so it's interesting. I wasn't sure if there'd be Holocaust tourism, which is really my more specific dissertation. There are some interesting postcards from concentration camps written by survivors who are going back there for memorials, or even tourists as early as the 1950s, that are being produced in some form by the museums that are set up, at least some camps like Auschwitz, the 1950s. So there's some stuff here that I didn't really talk about today, but I've bookmarked, and will hopefully make it into my dissertation. But my interest, I've always had the dissertation tourism, and my broader really interest has always been in Holocaust education. I used to be a high school teacher, and I think teaching about Holocaust memory to classroom mostly of non-Jews in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which was one of the most powerful experiences of my life, made me think about how Holocaust has become so prominent. And so, yeah, I was just looking through these collections. I found what I was able to, but I ended up Judy.
One of the things that people often ask is what draws you to the topic of the Holocaust in the first place? And people are always interested in knowing, why does somebody choose such a topic? So if you could say something about that in brief, I think our audience would be very interested in hearing about it.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate it. I've always been, I suppose, interested to a certain extent in Holocaust memory. It doesn't seem like it now, but in middle school, I remember taking out books during recess on the Einsatz group in my middle school library, which is maybe not what a healthy middle schooler should be doing. But it was something I took 1 or 2 courses on in as an undergraduate. But it wasn't until I became a teacher and I was teaching about Holocaust ethics that I kind of thought I was assigned this as a history teacher. And it really opened up this idea of, what does Holocaust memory mean 70, 80 years on? That it's kind of, everyone agrees you should teach about the Holocaust, right? This is not really a controversial thing to say in most American states or people, but what does it mean? Am I supposed to be teaching my students that the Holocaust means don't bully in the schoolyard? Because that's a pretty is that really it's a good message. Is that really the message of the Holocaust? Is it mean opposed totalitarianism? It's a tough message for 14-year-olds to get. Are you supposed to compare to the Holocaust? Are you supposed to should my students be making Holocaust references or thinking it in their head when they think about politics or affairs in general? A lot of people would say any Holocaust reference is controversial. And so that tension between how much Holocaust memory should be used, we all agree that it's powerful, but exactly how it should be used and the ways in which people do use it just got me, it fascinated. And there's so many tensions between this maybe a particular Jewish message to a universal human message about the Holocaust. And then I became interested in, wait, what happened in America? If there was a time when people didn't talk about it so much within the Jewish community, outside of the Jewish community, when did non-Jews? And for me, that's as interesting, I think, as Jewish organizations. Of course, Jews have a very particular relationship with the Holocaust, but I almost take that for granted. I'm really interested in when a particular ethnic event becomes important to people outside of that community for whom it is their quote unquote their history. And so here we are years later, and I'm doing a PhD, done a master's on it, and I'm working in it, and I'm obsessed with the museum world. And yeah.
Well, thank you for that answer. Very interesting to hear kind of how you got here with us. We have sort of a related question. You just spoke about your journey getting here. We have someone who wants to know if your time here at the museum with us has influenced or impacted um, some way in the research you think you'll undertake in the future, or potentially um, if it will impact what you're thinking of doing professionally in the future after this and after your PhD, of course.
Sure. Yes, after still have a few more years the PhD. So we shall see. I've always been very interested in the museum world. And I think for me the greatest value, I think I said this briefly at the beginning, is getting to see behind the scenes. I think I've been studying what tourists do, where they go, how they read about monuments, how they read about memorials, and try to do that almost consumer side to Holocaust memorialism in my PhD, to think about how curatorial decisions are made. Um, it's not a case of we do or don't think about uh, tourism. We don't think about, and again, tourism is very, I use that in PhD term more, think about people making travels and journeys to Europe, but people who just go to museums, I wouldn't necessarily say that's, of course, the same thing. I want to be careful there with that terminology. But as a curatorial team or in a museum, the amount of different pressures you have to look at, to using but also preserving the documents, to being responsive to a general audience, a more specific audience, to being accurate, to kind of fulfilling the criteria of collecting of the museums, just what objects remain and what they last. I think it for me, it's helped me think a little bit more clearly about when people respond to what's on display at a museum. Sometimes it's the creative choice of the museum. Sometimes it's just what is left over. Sometimes we don't have a lot of really well preserved aspects of some aspect of Holocaust history. So I think that's helped me get great clarity about how memorial organizations operate, as I kind of look at both sides of this. And again, I talk about it often in maybe almost like commercial terms, consumption and production, but of course you can say this in terms of artistic terms as well in a Holocaust museum. That is it's this dynamic relationship, and we get feedback of course the museum, of what people see, what questions they ask when they go through it, from people who want to donate or not donate objects to the museum. It's incredibly complicated. So say that.
Thank you. Sort of mixing things up here, we actually have a question for Judy, which I know we've gotten similar questions in interns past. But someone is wondering, what this process has been like for you, Judy, watching, you know, a bunch of different interns go through this process, pick different topics to research. And also, you mentioned with your question, you always like to ask what drew you to the Holocaust. And this person is wondering if you've noticed any sort of common themes or patterns in what different interns have chosen to study, even though it's been such a vast array of topics.
It's, as you said, have been a very vast array of topics. The common denominator is they're all interested in various aspects of the Holocaust. But more than that, everybody is drawn to it for a different reason, one for personal and one for professional, and one because of a chance encounter, and one because they taught and all of a sudden they realized this is what they wanted to do when they taught a subject for 1 year. Everybody is very different. What I feel, I think that it is an exciting and exhilarating thing for me every year to see interns come in and to start working on the collections. And as I was one of the people who worked on the core exhibitions, so I know what it's like. And when you were talking about the sukkah cover, I remember when we were going through the decision, are we going to use it and how we're going to use it and what room we're going to use it in. So for me, it was like an old friend seeing that sukkah cover again come up and say, oh, yes, I was supposed to say room so-and-so, but I wasn't going to interrupt your presentation. So yes, I feel wonderful when I see it. I feel that I'm very fulfilled. And more than that, I feel that if my father would be here, he would be thrilled to see young people learning about the subject, working on the subject, and passing it on to future generations. In fact, that's one of the things I'm in the process of starting a book about. How are we going to approach the Holocaust in the second half, or the second quarter at least, of the 21st century in a world without survivors? If you think about it, the youngest survivors, who were infants, are now in their 9th decade. And the oldest second generation, who were born just after the war, are creeping 80. How are we going to teach the Holocaust in a world where all the resources that we used to have, the human resources, are not going to really be available? A hologram isn't the same thing. And seeing young people pass on the, I don't know what I would call it, the torch, the baton onward, gives me hope that it's still going to work.
Well, thank you so much, Judy, for sharing that with everyone. I know we have just a few minutes left, so I think this is a nice question to sort of leave things off at. Jonathan, we have someone who's asking, they're interested in learning more about this topic, and they're wondering if there are any ways that the audience can kind of academically follow what you're working on, or if there's any other resources you might suggest for audience members who've been inspired to learn more about this topic.
Sure. Thank you. Well, watch this space. Hopefully, I'll have some publications coming out in the future. I'm kind of working on a co-edited issue in Holocaust studies right now with other folks who are thinking about the materiality of Holocaust memorialization. Like, what is the physical objects and the physical places where Holocaust memorial is displayed. I think that I'm very interested in the public presences of Holocaust memorial museums. They do a lot, digital museums, kind of in their public facing guide. So, I mentioned some of the works here by some of the scholars that I would look at. Peter Novick, Hazia Diner, James Young. There's a lot of interesting people working. Avril Alba in Holocaust memorialization. The museums themselves, whether it's Auschwitz, whether it's Yad Vashem, whether it's USHMM, of course, the Museum of Jewish Heritage. We have on our website, we talked about hologram technology, a big thing pioneered by the USC Shoah Foundation, which now the Museum of Jewish Heritage has its own examples of hologram technology where you can talk to survivors who've been interviewed, hundreds of questions, and you can ask them questions on our website, or you can come in person, do it at the museum, record a question, and it will pull a very similar answer that they have recorded in the past using word bank technology to do that. There's just really interesting, if you go out there, it's fascinating things. Holocaust television and film, there's books and books about it I could recommend. But there's also really interesting emergent technology going on in Europe. So I keep on seeing, and of course, Holocaust tourism sounds pretty edgy, but another one that is interesting, Holocaust video games. It's not as bad as it sounds like. There's some educational organizations in Germany that focus on educational technology for young people, or for, say, high school, secondary school, or age students that are working on Holocaust memory video game. So you play as a student discovering in like 1970, 1980s Germany, discovering evidence of Nazi atrocities in your school basement. And there's a great, interesting case like the Bullhauser Dam school where some killings went on. And so there's really interesting technology. And then there's just great writers who are asking in publications. And I'll just say Susan Neiman has been a huge influence on me, a philosopher in Germany, American Jewish philosopher, writes in Germany about what Holocaust memory means in Germany. What does that mean for America? Her book has been one of the most defining influences of my journey. And so, yeah, from video games, hologram technology, scholarly works. Hopefully, I will add one or two things, small additions to that. To keep up. It's an engaging world, and hopefully, as Judy says, to keep up, that legacy. People like her father, in the next quarter century, in the next decade, I think it's a very worthy mission. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. I know we have lots of people in the audience who will be keeping up with your work, and very impressed by how many different scholars and publications you were able to name by memory. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. And also thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Judy, for being here with us today, and sharing such a wonderful presentation, and question and answer session. Thank you so much to our audience for watching today and also engaging in the Q&A with us. If you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum, which you can do at mjhnyc.org/support. We also hope to see you for our upcoming programs, which you can again find on our website at mjhnyc.org/current events. Both of those links are in the chat for everyone. You can also watch past programs and also rewatch and share the recording of today's presentation, which will be available on the museum's YouTube next week. So again, thank you all so much for joining us, and a special thanks to Judy and Jonathan. It was really such a pleasure.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. We hope to see you soon.